Hello, I'm Ria Almeida with the Institute for Family Services, and I'm going to bring to you today some information and ideas about transformational healing with families and community. So these are the learning objectives for our session. 1. Participants will learn key assumptions and concepts informing transformative family therapy and identify their role in the therapeutic process. 2. Participants will identify 3 techniques and strategies that facilitate the implementation of transformative family therapy. 3. Participants will identify the 4 phases of CCM's implementation in therapy. And lastly, participants will articulate 2 critical features of the cultural context model that create a non-traditional link between therapeutic practices and community healing, as well as identify their use in video examples. So an overview of what we're going to talk about today is a review and critique of multicultural practices, white privilege or cultural competency, really beginning to see the difference between defining white privilege and using cultural competency as a way of underscoring white privilege. Transformative ideas in social justice or in liberation healing. And lastly, CCM is a paradigm that bridges community action with therapeutic initiatives. So the multicultural discourse in cultural competency has pretty much been used in the past 20 years in order to bring justice or fairness to most families on the margin. The question we ask today is attending to cultural difference a helpful signifier towards social justice? If the ideas of cultural competency have changed in the right direction, why hasn't the promise of cultural competency reduced disparities in schools, education, mental health, etc.? Are we moving in the right direction? Despite the mandates for mental health and physical care providers to be trained in cultural competency, there continue to be large disparities in physical health, mental health, education, housing, corrections, etc. So when we look behind the scenes of cultural competency, what we see is that there's an entire erasure of history around major events in the making of U.S. culture. There's no power analysis within and across essentialized groups like Latinos, African Americans, Asians, etc. It is simply an interiorized discourse. Cultural competency or structural violence. We talk about cultural competency, but we don't talk about structural violence at all. And structural violence is really the foundation by which people are otherized and by which people are marginalized. So the system of otherizing was intended to help the privileged understand those in need of help. It essentially was not designed to help those who need the services. The process of otherizing is anyone who's industrious can become an entrepreneur, creating dissonance, the industriousness of the oppressor and the laziness and dishonesty of the oppressed. This is the beginning of how we begin to separate those in power, mostly white, from those who are other, by creating a set of values and beliefs around those who are white versus those who are not. The notion about the universal right to education has not been the mainstay of cultural competency, and hence the idea of the right to education is pretty much looked at as a veiled right. So when we think about remembering, what do we remember in terms of U.S. history that clearly connects to the disposition of most families on the margin today? Placing Native Americans, for example, the Spanish-American War and the status of Puerto Rico, U.S. policies affecting Latin America, labor, NAFTA, etc., and its connection with the intersectionality of migration. U.S. global policies and connections to illegal immigrants don't often get thought about. Placing Native Americans in protective custody accompanied by genocidal policies, the enslavement of blacks, internment camps to Japanese Americans, the Asian Exclusion Act of 1882, etc., are all aspects of ways in which the remembering and contextual history of the U.S. has not been integrated into the multicultural discourse in a meaningful way. The implications is there's no analysis of power, privilege, and oppression. It is broad and with its broad and nuanced interconnectedness, no focus on perpetrators, systemic and interpersonal of oppression. There's a focus on within-group victimization based on anti-oppression theories, ethnicity, and culture are interiorized as the object of study. There's a use of a political language to describe different groups with no language to describe the hierarchical identities that occupy the space of multicultural discourse. In other words, there is no way to identify who the learner is and who the discourse is being created for in terms of service provision. The scholarship of otherizing colludes with the larger landscape of segregation. White privilege, the silence surrounding multiculturalism. Understanding whiteness in its relational sphere is key to understanding the other. While there have been articles here and there devoted to whiteness, the concept of whiteness, the very foundations of whiteness that determine access to care, that determine equity in terms of housing, schools, education, work, incarceration, are not clearly indicated or spelled out so that we have an understanding of how to work with clients and how to inform organizational structures in ways that they will decode whiteness in its collusion with marginalization of peoples. Giving voice and analysis to historic majority cultures that use concepts of culture to signify minority populations. As Audre Lorde says, helping the other is really seriously doubtful if we use the master's tools to dismantle the master's house. According to Arundhati Roy, there is no discussion taking place in the world today that is more crucial than the debate about strategies of resistance. Strategies of resistance are not something that we consider in therapeutic practices or in community action, but resistance processes are really essential to healing. So transformative ideas are changing the paradigm, the lens, and the journey. Social justice addresses the multiplicity of personal, social, and institutional locations. Much of cultural competency does not address the institutional locations of peoples or about the service providers themselves. It frames identities in therapeutic practice by locating these complexities within a social matrix that shapes relationships, power, privilege, and oppression. It also builds cultural borders rather than assuming that cultural groupings exist in segregated homes or spaces. So the hierarchies of power, privilege, and oppression are really what define intersectionality, going from the affluent, which is white men, upper middle class, white men, white gay men and women, lesbians who are out perhaps, or gay men who are out, and then the middle class, which consists of men of color, women of color, and families or individuals, and the working class, which includes poor whites, gay men of color, and lesbians of color who are out. The poor are single-parent families of color and youth of color. So liberation as a healing endeavor requires certain standpoints. Liberation has to be considered beyond the resolution of one's individual and emotional pain. In a culture where the individual sense of identity is so clearly marked and really scaffolded, it's important to understand that that is an illusion. There's an artificial bubble around the individual. In fact, no individual exists in isolation. All individuals exist in connection, but the connections are often muted. The liberation of others is intrinsically connected or entwined with the liberation of self. So decompartmentalized systems of healing. We currently have separated professionalism instead of versus activism, scholarship versus advocacy, and clinical work versus political work. Again, by bifurcating these categories, we fail to recognize that people are embedded in social, economic, and political systems, and therefore healing involves connecting with all these systems and understanding the relationship of individual and families to all of these multiple systems. Therefore, redefining political meanings and constructions of institutionalized categories of race, ethnicity, culture, class, and sexual orientation are key and central to the process of healing. Building community, what does that mean? Building community means bridging cultures, interrupting white supremacy at multiple levels, from organizational to personal to community, families partnering with progressive communities, building social capital through these connections, and creating therapeutic transparency through breaking down therapeutic assumptions. Again, a reflection of what a genogram or a family person, a family map would look like within the context of hierarchy, within the context of power, privilege, and oppression. A family genogram embedded here shows a family of color with a woman who is Puerto Rican and is the daughter of a single parent who works as a custodian in a school system. She's married to a Cuban who is lighter skinned, also middle class. Both his parents were teachers, and so there's more of a stability of income there and more of a buttress should anything happen economically to him. They have 3 young daughters, all dark skinned, and they fall in terms of their social location in the bottom, although their standpoints are connected to both the father and the mother, because there is the potential for them to move across those rungs of both whiteness, privilege, and economic access. Cultural context model, a new paradigm. These are the foundational concepts for transformational healing. Critical consciousness, empowerment, and accountability. Critical consciousness, as Paulo Freire has defined it, means being aware of the fact that washing one's hands of the conflict between the powerful and the powerless means to side with the powerful, not to be neutral. Raising critical consciousness. Again, Freire defines 3 different levels of consciousness: naive, mythical, and critical. Naive really means a sense of assuming as if the order of the world is just the way it is and we don't have any access to change, nor do we have any ability to relocate ourselves. Mythical is really the idea that if we do create change, it happens sort of in a random way and not necessarily by taking responsibility to change one's embeddedness in the systems of economics and politics. And critical is really having that sense of consciousness where we are aware of the fact that we're embedded in economic, political, and social systems, and whatever change we make individually is really very connected and merges with these larger systems and institutions. Talk and action, conversations within a community, tasks, rituals, and community building are all a part of raising critical consciousness. In other words, reading a book or reflecting by oneself individually does not raise critical consciousness. It has to be done within a community setting where there is the opportunity for dialogue, inquiry, and reflection. Creating and honoring a context for empowerment and accountability involves these prior levels of raising critical consciousness. Again, other methods for raising critical consciousness are through social education. We like to use film and literary discourse to inform client inquiry, dialogue, and reflection. We link sponsorship to social education, bringing in sponsors who are trained and have a critical awareness. They join us with the literary discourse in order to bring clients along and build critical consciousness. What we're going to see now is a little tape called From the Little Mermaid, and I would like you to take a look at how we essentially ally sponsors with new clients. This is the story of a man that contacted us indicating that he wanted to get our services. And when we did a genogram and tried to get the reasons for why he chose services at this point, he gave us a number of different presenting problems. One, he said that his wife and he, were fighting a lot, that they'd gone to couples therapists, the couples therapy was not working, and that his wife had essentially said to him that unless he straightened himself out at our place, she would either divorce him and or join him if she saw some progress. So you'll see Anthony, the client, and you'll see the sponsor. Now, they both watched the film The Little Mermaid, which is about the story of the Little Mermaid who falls in love with a human and realizes that in order to get the human, she'd have to leave her family and all her relatives and her way of life under the sea. So she's trying to cut a deal with Ursula, the sea witch, to find the best way to leave her environment. And Ursula tells her that she can, in fact, help her leave the sea, but there's going to be a huge cost to it. And the cost will be she'll have to lose her voice. So they watch the tape together, and then they have a discussion. And part of what happens in the discussion is Anthony then just reveals the fact that he has a lot of trouble with strong-willed women, with strong-voiced women. He believes women's place is in the home. He has some very rigid masculine ways of thinking about women and women's lives, and he really discusses this with the sponsor in a very open way in the first session. Empowerment. Empowerment means creating a context for listening and witnessing. It also means connecting both genders of all races, GLBTs, as well as underprivileged classes, to strategies of resistance, truth-telling, and social action. And it means creating a narrative of liberation. Accountability is when there's a total responsibility and an acknowledgement of harm brought to others or to another. Accountability begins with the acceptance of responsibility for one's actions and the impact of those actions upon others. Accountability also moves beyond blame and guilt. It results in reparative action that demonstrates empathetic concern for others by making changes that enhance the quality of life for all involved parties. Replacing cultural competency and otherizing with ethical healing. Here's another example about Christy. Christy is a 12-year-old Korean young woman who's had 2 experiences of hospitalizations around attempted suicides. Both times she was sent to Korean therapist. The assumption of the school and the other referring therapist of the hospital was that she was disconnected from her family of origin since her family represented a different generation of acculturation, and that she was isolated, and that was an explanation for her suicidality. In fact, what we learned very quickly was that Christy had been completely destroyed by white supremacist comments and actions beginning in the 1st grade, with really no action from the school district to protect her. And what had happened is she gained a very internalized sense of whiteness, felt that whiteness trumped the Korean culture, was a very angry kid, had no connections with her peers, was starting to fail in school, and really had no connection, a very limited bond with her parents as a result of these white supremacist attacks. So we spent a lot of time working with her, using the film narratives and dialogue, raising her consciousness about the connection between white supremacist attacks and her choices to use her anger towards harming herself, and transformed the idea that the suicide was because of her lack of connection to the Korean culture, but in fact linked it to the white supremacists' rupturing that she experienced early on. And within a period of 12 to 16 weeks, this young woman had completely transformed. She had started to create connections in school, was no longer angry with the teachers, was doing well in school, and went on to play music at Carnegie Hall. And there was never a context for dealing with the Korean culture in our transformative healing. What we did was bring the sense of ethics and equity to her healing process. So in summary, here's the context for therapy. The cultural context model involves a therapeutic team made of multiple genders and races and cultures. We have sponsors who are allies, who ally with us through different parts of the therapeutic trajectory. We have culture circles, which are mixed with men and women and come together in same-sex circles on some weeks and are joined together at other weeks. And lastly, within this concept of culture circles and our whole paradigm, we view families as subsystems and not whole systems in a bubble. The therapeutic team is a group of diverse trained therapists, as I said before. They're intended to reflect the client pool as much as possible. We're not defined by a funding source, therefore we have a completely integrated a system of intervention. Cases are not assigned by case. In fact, the entire team has the case. And so the clients view us as an entire holding family that holds each case. And there's power sharing between the clients and between the therapists. The sponsors, who are they? As I said before, they're men and women and adolescents as well who have a critical consciousness through working with us in dialogue and reflection. They sponsor and partner with the therapists to break the isolation of families, enhance connection and support, and build critical consciousness. They are also a community of mentors, role models who demonstrate versions of manhood and womanhood in which equity for all is the guiding value. Sponsors serve as an ongoing witness to empowerment and accountability. They're volunteers. And now we will see a brief clip of Robert J. Green, who's a researcher in California who interviewed our sponsors to get a sense of why many of the men would be interested in doing this work. And much of what he was told about repeatedly, and the two clips you're going to see are an interview with a very successful white businessman, a white Jewish businessman, and then an interview with a policeman. And they both essentially shared the same ideas with him. One is that they felt they both were tremendously helped by this process, by this particular healing model, even though they'd been in other therapeutic practices. They also felt that as men, their lives were so constricted in the larger world that by being in a space like this, they were able to, in fact, not only help others, but actually keep their families in this very liberated space, because they were always reminded of how constricted men's lives could be in the outside world. Culture circles, again, raising critical consciousness through bridging differences and similarities. That's what happens in the culture circles. And we build connections by building community. Culture circles, again, we see families as subsystems. Culture circles describes a heterogeneous helping community that emphasizes language and structure of social activism and denotes a break with traditional mental health. In other words, we do not create circles or groups based on presenting problem or based on a sameness of identity, and particularly not an identity that's defined from the mental health system. And the circles are organized, as I said earlier, by gender, and they meet bi-weekly. And then they come together in community on the alternate weeks. And lastly, we're going to see a case on empowerment and accountability. This is the case of a regretting father and partner, Paul. He is a policeman who basically had battered his wife and had created a lot of harm for his young children. His children were ages 8 and 10. And one of the sessions you're going to see here is after he had been in the Batterers Intervention Men's Program. His partner requested that we do couples work because she had hoped that he had gotten enough from the program that he would be able to begin to heal the marital relationship. The tape starts with a marital session, again with Paul and his wife Janet and some sponsors, and it moves into the men's circle. And what you'll see in the couple session is that he is not able to hold his anger. He's very confrontational, and he again begins to define his reality over hers. That notion continues in the men's circle, where the men in a very loving and accountable way begin to challenge him about what it means to be a man that has expanded norms, that can assert his needs, but at the same time not harm anybody else or not insist on his positionality as being the only position that's possible for change. So we hope you'll see this tape and see the very nuanced and larger ways in which the men's work is done in order to create possibilities for liberation for him and for his family. I lastly want to end with a quote from Wole Soyinka, who's a Nigerian novelist. He says, well, the first thing is that truth and power for me form an antithesis and antagonism which will hardly ever be resolved. Truth for me is freedom, it's self-destination. Power is domination, control, and therefore a very selective form of truth, which is a lie. And the polarity between these two, in fact, forms for me the axis of human striving in the creation of an ethical society and ethical community.